I don't know if any of you are like me, pondering the small details of the Bible. For example, around this time during Easter, when we read and we reread the Passion of the Christ, I wonder why it is that it happened around Passover. Was that a coincidence? Or was it something that God allowed for a particular reason? Hebrews 10, verse 1 tells us that the law was a shadow of the things to come. Shadow being a reflection of the thing and not the actual thing itself. Is it possible that the Passover was a shadow of Jesus' crucifixion? For the next couple of minutes, I want to examine the similarities between Jesus and the Passover sacrifice, and then describe to you the benefits that it has for us. Although we know the story, I'm going to review some of the key points of the last plague in Egypt. God had explained to the people that he had intended to destroy the firstborn of every human and every animal. To obtain protection, the Israelites had to take a lamb that was a year old. It had to be without blemish, and they had to use its blood to put on the tops and the sides of the doorpost and with hyssop. While the angel of death passed through Egypt, they had to roast this lamb and eat it with bitter herbs and with bread made without yeast. No bone in this lamb's body was to be broken. It wasn't to be boiled in water, and so they weren't going to have curry goat. They weren't going to have mannish water that day. There was no time to butcher, and there was no time to let the bread rise with the yeast. Even then as well, not even the dogs would make a peep. So how does this compare to the sacrifice that Jesus made on the cross? This animal was a male, without blemish, without defect. It couldn't have been blind, it couldn't have been lame, it couldn't have been mutilated in any way. Obviously, Jesus was male, but more than that, Jesus was without blemish or defect. He was without sin. In reference to Jesus, Hebrews says in 4 verse 15, "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way just as we are, yet he did not sin." 1 Peter 2 also says, "He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth." The sacrificial lamb was also roasted. While reading Unger's commentary on the New Testament, we're told that this described Jesus' suffering. He too was roasted. We can hear his mental anguish as he says, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." He was slapped and spat upon by the Sanhedrin, the ruling council of the Jews. He was beaten and mocked by the soldiers. He carried his own instrument of death as he walked to Golgotha. Then he hung on the cross, struggling to breathe as others mocked him. Then, when it was finished, because Jews did not want those who were on the cross to stay there, the soldiers ensured their death by breaking their legs. Only Jesus, who was already dead, did not have a bone in his body broken, just like the Passover lamb was not to have a bone in its body broken. But how is this relevant to us, here and now? Let us examine this word, pesh, P-E-S-A-H. I'm told that it's the word that we translate into Passover. I'm also told that this is an insignificant meaning. It's not sufficient. It's more like protection. It gives the image of the Lord standing in front of the door of these Israelites, protecting them as the angel of death passed through Egypt. The blood on the door purified the place so that the Lord's presence could abide there. In a similar way, Jesus shed his blood for us, covering us, purifying us. Hebrews 9, verse 22 tells us, in fact, the Lord requires that nearly everything be cleansed with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. In this way, we are protected from eternal death, eternal separation that comes in the end. The blood was applied with hyssop. I'm told that hyssop was a common field plant, and it's meant to typify faith. It is only by faith that we can apply the blood of Jesus to our lives. There are other points that I want to make here. 1, the plague in Egypt was God bringing judgment to the various Egyptian gods. In destroying the firstborn of Pharaoh, God was bringing judgment upon Pharaoh himself. Egypt believed that their pharaohs were gods, and he ruled with a strong hand, holding dominion over his people. God, by taking his firstborn, would be destroying the heir to his throne, showing up Pharaoh. The IVP Bible background commentary put it this way: this was a blow to Pharaoh's person, his kinship, and his divinity. Jesus' death on the cross was a blow to those things in our lives that had dominion over us. Romans 6:20 tells us that we are no longer slaves to sin. Hebrews 2, verse 14 tells us that Jesus destroyed the power of the devil and took away the fear of death. What a mighty blow Jesus dealt to those things that could have plagued us. Have you ever considered why it was that Moses would tell Pharaoh that during the plague not even a dog would bark or an animal or a human being? In those days, Fido was not a pet. Dogs were like rats. They were nuisances and easily agitated. The description of their silence was a description of an unusual calm. Could you imagine that while the shrills of the Egyptians rang out because of their dead, that the dogs who would usually cry out would be at peace? God has brought about a peace in the homes of the Israelites that affected even the wandering animals. I'd like to say that this reflects the peace of God that he brings into our lives through the blood of Jesus. That even though the world is in chaos, we have an unusual peace. Last but not least, the children of Israel were instructed to commemorate this event yearly. Yearly, they would eat the lamb, the bitter herbs, and the unleavened bread. The roasted lamb and the unleavened bread reminded them of the rush they were in to leave Egypt. The bitter herbs reminded them of the bitter slavery that they endured. In similar fashion, we take a sacrament of communion. While eating Jesus' flesh and drinking his blood, we need to reflect. We need to reflect on the sacrifice that Jesus made as he was emotionally and physically tortured and died. We should consider the benefits that the covering of his blood has obtained for us. There is no more fear of death as the power of the devil was stripped away. There is an unusual calm that we are afforded as the world is in chaos. We should be reminded that Jesus truly is the Passover sacrifice.